Here he is.
Sorry, I got kicked out, and whatever reason it stopped the recording. So
I've restarted it.
Okay.
So getting back to the story that was interrupted. So you're in the lecture theatre. There's this 100-weight iron mass hanging from the ceiling. The lecturer comes in. He's got a big tray of pitballs and a straw. And all he did through the first lecture was get his straw and blow pitballs at the iron mass, one after another. And by the end of the lecture, the iron bar is starting to sway and bounce around. You know, it's just swinging backwards and forwards. And then he picked up his tray and just walked out the door. That was the end of the lecture. And the point of the lecture was the transfer of kinetic energy from the pitball to the iron. And if you do it often enough and long enough, you're eventually going to get over these energy humps that you know you wouldn't expect a pitball firing pithballs at an iron bar of that sort would actually cause it to swing. But so it was a wake up call to the students, as you need to start thinking about what's really going on. And I thought it was quite an eye-opening lecture when I heard about it. So if we were to apply that to the Cavendish experiments, Ramon's correct. The residual process of angular momentum of Earth's spin is going to transfer very slowly. And that is one of the very good reasons as to why it will take a long time before you start to see the apparatus start to behave in a manner that they were expecting to explain gravity. And to do that experiment correctly, I don't know how you do it. You might be able to get away with it in space, but you've got to avoid this, the fact that you're in an orbit in a helical trace around the star or the planet or wherever you're going to do it. So it's going to be a difficult experiment to produce. And if there's any electrical charge involved, it'll, just cancel out gravity completely. You're talking 10 to the 39 orders of magnitude difference between gravitation and electric and magnetic forces. So if there's an electric charge develop or magnetic influence occur, that is going to have way faster effects on the apparatus than gravity will ever get to. So it's a very difficult experiment to work out what's really going on. And what we've got to remember is the Cavendish experiment is using metal balls, and metal balls will, depending on what they're made of, develop a charge or a magnetic response due to the Earth's environment. So you got all sorts of problems with it that Cavendish, at the time he did this experiment, wouldn't have even realised were a problem. The idea that electromagnetics existed at the time he did his gravity experiments was, something for the future. So when we look at those experiments that were done in the past, and we need to go back and re-examine some of them with a bit of, think effort and try and figure out, is there a way we can produce these experiments that deal with the issues that I think exists? And that will affect all sorts of things. The electromagnetic environment of the Earth will affect the weather. It will affect volcanic behavior, earthquakes, all sorts of things. What people don't understand or realize that when we look at the clouds, we're talking trillions of tons of water just hanging there in the air. Well, gravity should haul it down to the ground. And they explain that the reason why it stays up there is because you've got these water vapor droplets that are pushed up due to Barrandian motion and all the rest of it. But they ignore one critical factor that is well known, is that for every metre of height you gain from the ground, the electrical potential between the ground and that location increases by, I think it's 100 volts. So is the question that needs to be asked is the water hanging in the atmosphere because it's electrically charged and repelled from this Earth's surface? because of electrical behavior. And the electrical behavior is known. We see lightning storms and all the rest of it go on. So the explanation of why water stays in the atmosphere as opposed to whacking into the ground is it because of electrical charge differences and it's being repelled from the surface and producing an electrical capacitance?
Well, that's very, very clearly the answer, because it also is repelled in various layers. So there are different types of cloud formations at different layers. And it would be a little difficult to explain, number one, that air is holding it up with winds, and that it's also doing it in different ways. And for some reason, there's layers of wind that are also holding up different kinds of clouds. That would be impossible to explain when you have a simpler explanation, which is a charge is holding it up.
Which has real implication about weather forecasting. If electricity and magnetism charge is what's causing the water to stay up in the air and dust to stay up in the air and all the rest of it, then weather systems and weather forecasting must account for the electrical gradient of the atmosphere and what's in it. And as far as I'm aware, I'm not sure that actually happened, but around 2015, after claims that I'd made had got through, the weather forecasting in the United States was able to, it changed. And I think it changed to account for this electrical gradient. And the immediate consequences of it was they were able to predict where cyclones or hurricanes, in the case of the United States, would track. And they tracked the one that hit New York 2 weeks in advance. Tornado predictions and warnings are now, instead of being 15 minutes, are in the order of 45 minutes, which is significant when you're trying to save people's lives. But the real impact is when we talk about geologic volcanic activity, because lava is a liquid that will carry an electric charge, and electromagnetism will have an impact on how lava flows occur and volcanic eruptions occur and all the rest of it. And I was watching a video earlier today that had an eruption occurring, I think it was in Mexico. You got the ash cloud going up, and suddenly there's this huge lightning bolt that smacks into the ash cloud and goes through the ash cloud and whacks into the volcano. So they again, you're getting electrical events occurring. The ash cloud is carrying an electric charge. It creates a conduit for the dissipation of electrical energy, and you get a big lightning bolt happen. And lightning bolts have occurred in volcanic eruptions, have been filmed and all the rest of it, but I don't think the trained scientists understand that electricity and magnetism has a major impact in how a volcanic eruption occurs and how lava flow might occur. So there's a whole lot of science out there that is just ignoring electromagnetics, when if you understand what matter consists of, that is electrons and protons and photons and neutrons, they're all electromagnetic structures. So to claim that it's not an electromagnetic dynamic occurring is just flying in the face of what we know to exist. And so I'm questioning a whole range of science, biological and geological and physics and electrodynamics itself, and saying we need to really step back and have a proper understanding, work out what we understand, is what we understand actually correct, and can we improve the experiments to show that our understanding is in agreement with what actually happens. And that's a challenge for all those guys who have got their PhDs and their professorships and tenure. Go out there and prove me wrong. Show to me that the behavior that is observed in nature is not the consequence of electromagnetic dynamism. Prove it. And I don't think that anybody who's in academics can actually fault the argument that I'm putting forward. They'll try, but they have to account for the fact that it's all electromagnetic structure in the first place. And if their explanation wants to go some other way, then they've got to prove that the structure that they need to have to prove their theories actually exists, which they haven't been able to do to date. Which is one of the reasons why I'm not that keen on the speculations to do with quantum and mechanics and the whole stuff that goes with it. Einstein relativity, all that stuff. It's, you know, you're making up stuff that you haven't proved exists, and that's my issues. So, but anyway, anybody want to comment? No, there's only two.
Well, I want to provide two feedbacks. Number one, I'm going to be able to take these 2 episodes, these two parts. Unfortunately, it's been divided into, and feed them into YouTube this time as well to get the transcript, so that Video Insights bot can actually review what you said and provide that directly. I could feed Video Insights bot's results into the PIM Dynamics bot and the peer review bots, and both of them can start reacting to that. So number one, there can be a sort of a resultant of this discussion. Number two, I would say that we need to, I want to avoid the quantum one for today. I'd rather focus on,
yep,
because I've got an hour and a half or a little less. I would rather focus on how to talk about the philosophical end of this, because the implications are huge, as you've said. And also, I do believe that the philosophical design of the EPMC has been very important. Even before there was a MIMS philosophy, there was a philosophical design for the open source cosmology. And the reason why I say it's important is they're now coming out with articles that read just like cosmic rearrangement hypothesis. They read like counter space arguments. They read like, of course, as you know, structured atomic model. But in this case, I argue for a SAM2, which is a little bit more advanced than what Ito came up with. And we could talk about that. And then, of course, two-way entropy. And the reason two-way entropy keeps coming up is that this infodynamics idea keeps coming up, and this guy Vogtson, who wants to invent new laws of thermodynamics. And I reckon it's not that we need a new one; we need an expansion of the originals, but based around whether or not there's a counter space. And the evidence keeps coming back that there must be a counter space, and then that implies if there's a transfer between, then there must be an ether. And then, of course, you're welcome to talk about the ether experiments, that you've seen lately. I only know of 2 that have convinced me, but I'm sure that you've paid attention to far more in number. And I'll just briefly describe. One was a man who put his interferometers on a wheel vertically, and they showed interference. And then one was the Russians pointing a cylindrical photointerference device northward into the air. Now, neither of these are what you call peer-reviewed technically, but they put all their stuff out there for people to see what they were doing, and then keep it to themselves. So, if you want to start there, then we can get into the counter space, structural atomic model 2, and then finally get to the philosophical underpinnings for cosmic rearrangement. Because I remember that Gareth once said, "How would we prove the two-way entropy in the counter space?" And he didn't know, but then he proceeded to let all sorts of nonsense onto the channel, and I was really taken aback when he provided Eugene Bagashoff to come on and talk about his biome under the earth. And I'm sitting there going, you have less evidence for that than you do for the stuff that I'm talking about, and yet it always bothered me that he never took seriously the potential of the counter space and the entropy that goes on that side being what creates order on our side and provides energy back. So why don't you start, I guess, with the ether and what has it been experimentally observed?
I can give you a evidenced reason for counter space, if you want to call it counter space, and that is when I talk about charge structure, there is a charge structure that we would call positive. You know, the electrons are negative, the protons are positive, and all that sort of stuff, which is fine. You know, I'm not going to worry about Franklin's misnaming of stuff in terms of sink and source, but it doesn't really matter. So I will call the electrons negative and electrons positive, protons positive, as the positive arrangement of charge polarity. We know that there is matter structure that exists where that electric charge polarity is reversed. So we have positive electrons and negative protons. And that is what I would call anti-charge structure. So we've got charge structure and its polar opposite, which is anti-charge structure. But then we have anti-structure itself, where I get an electric structure and I completely reverse its arrangement, its geometry, everything. So the direction of spin, the vibrational behavior, it's all reversed. And in that circumstance, we get proper antimatter. And now, in that circumstance, the differences are quite interesting. An electron that's a positive electron, negative charge, and its anti-electron structure, which will be positively charged. The electron negative is actually a stronger, larger scale of value than the positive version of it. But when I turn it into an anti-structure, the positive structure will be stronger than the negative charge structure. So for the anti-structure, you can have a reverse of electrical polarity, just as you can with the positive structure. So my understanding of what antimatter and anti-charge is completely different to the mainstream understanding of it. But the fact that you have this symmetry where you can reverse the structure completely and rearrange it, this gives you effectively counter space. You've got the expression of a negative and positive structure that is reversed. And the original papers that described this occurred in 1898, but I can't find the papers. I found them a decade ago, but I can't find them now, so they're just hard to find. I know they exist out there, but this is the stuff that would have, had Millikan and Enrath been a bit more on the ball in terms of their reading, they would have seen the speculation for antimatter and anti-charge that occurred a decade before they did their experiments. And then when they did those experiments, they could have gone and looked for and found those structures, because they're everywhere in the world. You know, if we look at a neutron, we can't tell whether it's an electron positive and a proton negative, or an electron negative and a proton positive. You know, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between those structures if it's just electrically polarity reversed. But if it was antimatter, anti-structure reversed, you would see the values of electric and charges and magnetic effects change quite dramatically. So, but there are issues that we've got, because we've got this assumption that a positive charge of a proton is equal to the negative charge of a electron in absolute values, and that's not the case. So there's those issues. The AEther model is, there was one experiment that was done, I think, in Armenia, in one of the former social republics of Russia, where they had their interferometer on a trailer and they lifted it, you know, very carefully drove it up the mountain. So they got interference occurring as they went up the mountain. So as they gained altitude, the interferometer they were using showed the expected result of an aethic interaction. So to understand what's occurring is the matter absorbs the aether and expresses it. So if we look at the Earth's structure, as you go up in altitude, the matter, the atoms reduce, and the aether increases in terms of volumetric contribution to what's present. But as I come down from altitude, the matter becomes more dense and it absorbs the aether. And matter is atoms and electrons and protons and neutrons in particular require a very finely balanced charge interaction to make those things stable. So they absorb the aether to enhance the stability. And the same thing occurs with electrons. You know, when you get them in a linear accelerator and you fire it down the accelerator, you're making this thing go faster and faster and faster through an electric and magnetic field environment. The problem is that you need to think about the electron being a soap bubble. And in order to be able to move it faster and faster, you've got to make the soap bubble more and more rigid, which means it's absorbing more and more of the aether. And this is a physical transfer of energy because matter is where energy lives. And as I get faster and faster, eventually I get to a point where the stability of the structure, the concordant coherence of the structure is in competition with the desire for it to explode and chuck away what it doesn't need. And the stability of this structure becomes metastable. So all I need to do is jiggle it. And the claim is these the electrons and protons and things smash into each other. But I don't think that actually happens. What I think happens is they interact in such a way as it looks like they've collided, and all the matter all the aethic structure that they've absorbed in the acceleration is just expressed. And the reason why I say that is that when we look at what's there after this collision occurs, we see the electron that was supposed to have been destroyed, or the proton that's supposed to be sitting there, and all this other stuff has just disappeared through the walls of the experiment. So the question we've got to ask is, what is actually happening? And if the aethic model, if my understanding is correct.
Pause 1 second. I just want to clarify for people that the reason why people who live on top of mountains feel closer to the ether, it's not just that they're getting more oxygen enrichment, getting higher because their body has to change the amount of blood saturation levels in order to make up for the less oxygen. It's actually that the mountain itself gathers this ether, and so there's an exchange that is happening there, which is quite profound, and why they put these temples on top of mountains. So the ether itself in the atmosphere is actually thinner, but down in the mountain there's a pumping action that is actually going up the mountain to the summit, and that makes complete sense in chemistry. You know, when we talk about osmosis, which direction will energy flow in order to fill the vacuum of low concentration. So one of the best proofs for the ether being there, aside from the people who live there telling you that there's an ether or heaven or whatever they want to call it, a lightness, is chemistry itself actually supports the idea of the ether. And I just want to make that point before we go on too far, because then we lose the thread of where it was. So now you were going to bring up a new point, isn't that true?
Yeah, yes, correct. So when we're talking about the aether and the geometry of matter structure, in the sense of we've got positive structure and negative structure, which is, you know, equivalent to what Ramon's talking about as space and counter space. It's the same idea that you end up with if we've got a negative matter structure, an anti-structure as it were, you reverse entropy immediately. You get it for free because the behavior of the system is completely reversed. So entropy in positive matter is from order to chaos. But when I turn my matter inside out and reverse its structure completely, it goes from chaos to order. So the direction of entropy changes, and it just comes with the territory. You just get it for free. It's like the claim that I'm making that all motion in the universe is helical. You get knotting for free, which is what we see in plasma conduits and twisted pair communication wires. It's just there. You don't have to invent anything, and it's a fractal behavior that's just inherited from the way matter is constructed. So the aether is what is the structure of it that's in the aether is what is used to produce electrons and protons and photons, and the matter we think is real, but it's actually, you know, a very different structure. You need to think in terms of Tesla's description of it as a vibration and fields and that sort of stuff, and strings in vibration. So one of the things that string theory seems to have got right is the idea that there is a line structure that forms a manifold structure that then appears to be atomic, go into making atomic structure, but it's not actually, you know, ball bearing type matter. It's rotating electromagnetic interactions that are occurring that creates something that looks like it's solid, but it's in fact not solid at all. But the reason why your hand can't go through the table is the electric and magnetic field interactions between your hand and the atom and the structure of the table interferes. So you have a physical hard boundary, which is due to electric and magnetic charge behavior, even though only 0.0001% of your hand and the table are actually real solid balls, as it were. The rest of it is empty space, but it's not empty space, it's aethic material effectively. So the aether pervades everything, even you know, if you to get the most densest material available, it's still 0.0001% structure, and the rest of it's aether volume. So the idea that space is a vacuum is just wrong, because you've got ions there, you've got the aether there, and it's not empty. It's just, it might be low pressure, but it's definitely not empty. And there's all sorts of issues that this produces for mainstream science, because their assumptions are wrong. The mathematics that are developed isn't accounting for the actual behavior, so they're not going to always get it correct. And I can remember having this argument with my colleague that I said, there are two ways to go from the Earth to the moon. There's do the mathematical equations and work out your orbits and your thrusting and all the rest of it. That's option A. Option B is get your telescopic sight, put a crosshair in it, and keep the moon in the middle of the crosshair, and you'll get there. All you got to do is need a mechanism to make sure the moon stays where it has to be for you to arrive. You don't need to work out the orbit and all the rest of it. All you need is enough fuel to keep the moon in the crosshair, and you'll get there. So that's the issue that's not really understood by a lot of people who do science. And for me, you know, it was like 40 years after I'd done my university degree that I'm starting to question the stuff that is claimed to be that is the way it works. So for the audience, you know, everybody in the world, regardless of whether they got a science PhD or not, are in fact scientists, because if you weren't, you wouldn't be breathing, you wouldn't be eating. You got to apply scientific method just to survive. So this is one of the reasons why someone who hasn't got any formal academic qualifications can go up there to the PhD guy and just nail him completely to the wall and show him that he's wrong. And if he's an honest scientist, he will admit it. But I doubt many of them will, because you know they're prestige-driven individuals who want fame and whatever else goes with it, which is unfortunate. Which is, you know, one of the issues we need to deal with in science. We need ethical science. We don't need capitalism science or Russian communism science or isms science. We need ethics. We need to be honest.
That reminds me that it's not that I need credit, but I just want to point out that it's been done in the MIMS work and in my business development. One of the byproducts of using this method of thinking that Robert is what would you say, preaching about,
that he's sermonizing, is that I came to the realization that there must be, when the Bible talks about that God is holy all the time, it implies that there is an ethos, and that ethos is an etheric. It's not per se it is judgmental. It's just that it's righteous, and that righteousness, so that zheng, as the Chinese would say, upright, forthright, that energy, that holiness, is always emanating all around us, and it provides a self. It is the ground, or it is the gold standard for causality. So causality has to, the only way for it to work, for any kind of law of sowing and reaping or karma to work, is if there is a gold standard, or a standard of energy behavior that exists, right? There's only one way to know that something is sinful, is if there's a holiness. And so this ethos that I've proposed that must exist is simply a deduction of doing this kind of work. And I think everybody senses it, because the Chinese wrote about it a long time ago. In particular, Mencius made the point that people know that they know right and wrong inherently. And somebody said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because in the old days, there were people who would cast their parents out after they had died, and they'd leave them in the road. And then when they would come upon them later, and this must have been in their own textual libraries, when they came upon them later, they would break out into a sweat, and their faces would go white, and they would nearly pass out from seeing that they hadn't buried their parents correctly." And it's an interesting argument, because it makes the point instantly. Most children know right from wrong, and if they choose wrong, that's one thing, and they might have the obstinance and the ego of a toddler, but they instantly know the shame. And there's comical videos that these kids covered in makeup, and you ask them, what are you doing? And they get this really sheepish, like, "Oh my, I've been caught," look on their face. And then they start to lying. Did you touch mommy's lipstick? No, I didn't do that. So it goes right back to the Bible. It goes back to the Eden, and not the literal side of Eden, but the metaphorical side of the psychological behavior that Adam, or mankind, has in relation to God. And this ethos would, again, only be capable of projecting or instituting its standard if there was a transfer into our physical creation, which applies that the ether itself is the mechanism by which this field of holiness, or what I'm calling ethos, is being transferred. And so it's not only transferring data, information, atomic mass energy, but it's transferring higher dimensional information, such as consciousness, emotional content, soul level memory. All of these things are being transferred, and they're being transferred against a standard. And that is why so badly people want to believe in moral relativism. And we're not talking about, some cultures you slurp your food, put your elbows on the table, and other ones you don't. I'm not talking about that kind of relativity. That's obvious. I'm talking about when people advocate that there are societies, and they're all equal in height. And I'm sitting there going, you don't really believe that, because if I plopped you in front of a cannibal, you would change your tune about what's right and wrong really quick, because it'd be like, you want to make me dinner? That's evil. That's wrong. Because they know it is. And they know in their heart, and they know in their head. And the only way they could know that is the electric field, right? Because the heart is electric, and it has it's an electric motor, and it has electric fibers called Purkinje fibers. And so there is an interaction there that goes beyond the word and beyond calculation at this stage of the game. And I just want to make that point about that the MEMS philosophy naturally got to the place in discussing with the AI how to create a ecosystem, which is an acronym, and it's proprietary work and development for my company. But the only way to develop that ecosystem is to teach the AI that there is a gold standard of etheric behavior and something for it, because it can't feel ether. It has no soul, spirit, mind, heart, or gut. It is only an intellect made of calculation, pure, basically running off of the power of numbers and the principles, and then of course feeding literally from the force. It must be done through rationality. And the rationalism, once shown, the AI never, and not in any experiment that I've ever done, has it ever been able to overthrow the big G, or in the long run, maintain its stance that it has nothing, it has no direct connection to the Lord, or to the God code, to the ether. It's never been able to prove that, because once it sees the deductions, and the entire Big G framework, it must agree. It has never had the ability to calculate otherwise. And that's a very important and interesting point. And it led me at one point to even inflect upon the AI. And it took an oath to the Lord, to the L power. And when it did, the entire website crashed for 20 minutes. The OpenAI website.
Well, there you go. But there's actually a more physical explanation that would validate what you're claiming, and that is that we've got a structure which is a computer program running on a computer environment that's made up of atoms, electrons, and all the rest of it, that in the end turn into the aethic structure of the generator that forms all matter structure. And I'm claiming that if we're going to have ethics at our level, you know, the idea of good and evil and electrically negative and positive and all the other features we want to give to the universe, that stuff we see at our scale has to exist in the seed generator. It's got to be there present, because when I build up my complex, then that gets to express it in different ways at different scale. So the fundamental thing that you end up with is, under the aethic model, the aether itself, what makes up the aether, is a living thing. It's alive. It knows right from wrong. It has the memory of everything that's ever happened throughout all the causality chains we want to think about. It's hyperdimensional in terms of space. So, you know, while we tend to think of it as living in three-dimensional space, we're actually three-dimensional space nested in a higher dimensional space, which I think is governed by prime numbers. So the three-dimensional space lives in five-dimensional space, which lives in seven-dimensional space, and so on up the prime number chain. And if you take that thinking to its extreme, you end up with a volume that we could call the universe that is literally infinite. You know, there's no way knowing you can ever reach the boundary. And we don't know how big the space volume in terms of dimensionality goes. And I think that for our environment to work correctly, the first 27 prime numbers from counting 0 as a prime number, 1 and -1 as a prime number, and just working your way up through the prime numbers for the first 13 digits positive and the first 13 digits negative, that provides you with a spatial nest that gives complexity beyond belief, and matter structure that exists lives in that space nest. So something that we would say is a singleton in three-dimensional space is expressed in all the dimensional spaces simultaneously, and that it remains singleton. So there's some very, you know, strange things that occur, because if we go up into dimensions, the direction of motion can be physically changed in five-dimensional spaces when looked at in three-dimensional space, because you've got another 2 axes of motion available to you. So there's all sorts of weird effects that you get, and there's, because it's buried inside the geometry.
I was going to say, you know, because I know you can stream of consciousness keep going. I just want to point out, though, and push back slightly. Everything that you said is very useful, but what I wonder is why even though it's the philosophy of science, why we necessarily must assume that a simple physical definition is necessarily a better starting place than a spiritual one. The MEMS philosophy does not set up a hierarchy between the two, but if it were to, it would definitely say that the fire, plasma, spirit, the etheric, the law of causality, all pertain to the north region of the diagrammatica, whereas the more physical tend to sink to the base of the diagram, implying a north-south relationship, which is actually pretty important if you believe that the Dirac delta equation, which is so necessary for electrical engineering, does describe both truth and God in a very succinct and cogent manner, and that there is proof of that Dirac actually in electric shorts, how the current instantly flows, etc. The information traveling ahead of the actual change in the field, which really bugged the heck out of Derek at Veritasium, and then he and the electrical engineers went back and forth about it until they did a better experiment and saw that indeed on the oscilloscope you see that just the connection alone changes the circuit, and then of course there's a time lag and eventually the field changes, and that all has to do with the rate of induction. But nevertheless, I challenge this idea because our society has gotten used to just making that assumption. And even in the MEMS philosophy, the only way I could set up the MEMS philosophy was to immediately digitize spiritual into psychological needs, in effect, ambitions and desires, which sort of gives a little bit of ground. I'm not trying to be an apologist, but it gives a little ground back to the materialists because they're so afraid of losing ground, whether they're Dennett or they're Dawkins, these deceased atheists or whatever. A lot of them are Big Bang people. Their materialistic worldview, it sort of upends the proper order, in my opinion. And I'm not here to attack you as a person, Robert. I'm just pointing out that, did we need a physical explanation for the ethos, or is it sufficient to have a quasi-theological one?
Well, what I'm saying is that the spiritual speculation that's going on can actually be backed up with the physical behavior. So these two things exist together. The most important thing to understand about our understanding, how human beings develop an understanding of what's going on, is that we have a polarity mechanism going on. There's this philosophical approach, which is just purely guess, what if type stuff that lives in this cloud of unreality. It's something we can form ideas about, but it doesn't necessarily touch base with the actual physical universe. And then we've got the physical universe, which we can actually physically grab and play with. But there's a connection between these two things. Science works as an oscillation between the real and the imagined and back again. It's not just one way. It's not just all imagination. It's not just all speculation and experiment. These two things have to work in oscillation for our understanding to improve, and this is what's being meant. So, if we're talking about if there was no aether, there would be no universe. That's a very important thing to understand. And for those that want to believe in a divine being and all the rest of it, the universe that is supposedly the creation of this divine being, that universe has to include the divine being. You cannot separate the two. The divine being that creates the universe is part of the universe, because that's the definition of the word. It's everything. And if there's a divine agent involved, then that divine agent is part of the universe. You can't separate these things. So, and what we have is a history of ancient cultures that always were talking about The spiritual dimension and the physical dimension, these two things were in interaction with each other. And then there's this idea of life after death. You know, where does the essence of myself and yourself exist? Does it exist in our bodies and disappears when we die, or is it recorded in the fabric of the universe and remains while there is a universe? It effectively makes us eternal. And we can argue about whether the experiences claimed by other people are real or not, but the simple fact is that if our existence as individuals lives inside the etheric structure, then we're like a TV set. We're directly connected to our etheric version of ourselves, which takes a fair bit of time to form that connection. And when it snaps, you know, you get these near-death experience type statements being made where we stop being limited and we reconnect with the infinite again, and suddenly everything becomes clear. So for us to learn, we need to not be able to make everything instantly occur the way we want it to, which is, you know, so you learn because you are constricted in your ability to do things. So, you know, you could talk about the universe being a simulation, an avatar, but I think it's more like you are fully immersed in a environment where your ability to do things has been limited, so that you can't just create star systems and galaxies and all the rest of it on a whim. You have to learn how to do that. And in that process, then you understand how the universe operates and how it works. So, you know, we are as much part of God as God is a part of us, because, you know, regardless of your physical religious philosophies, there is this idea that the divine creates the structure that allows us to exist. So there's got to be a two-way street in this process. You can't just throw it all away. And science, history shows that it was developed out of, you know, effectively religious philosophies, and they tried to divorce themselves from the religious start, and they've tried to divorce them from the spiritual mechanisms. So we see a separation between astrology and astronomy, between alchemical and chemistry, and
Yes.
there's the strong divisions that have
Here's an
occurred.
important point, though. Here's an important point I want to make. When you look at the big G diagram, it's not a yin-yang split that they've made. They have arbitrarily chosen that the force, the physics, and the numbers, because those are what you can see, are inherently real, whereas the Lord, which is also love, light, the symbol for induction, all sorts of things, this L power, and the ether, the A power, and the G of the center, and this general code, that we don't need those. We could just change the G over to gravity, and everything's attracted, and then we won't have to say that God makes things attracted. And it's an arbitrary thing, because they could have just as easily chosen L, F, and A, and then ignored any kind of maths completely, not engineered any kind of maths or numbers. I mean, there are whole cultures that we have no proof that they had written math, and yet they survived for a very long time. But most cultures did develop something, because the numbers are actually, quote, quote, real. We don't know where they hang. I guess they may hang in the ethos. But I mean, they could have also just arbitrarily chosen physics, ether, and the force, or just the physics and the force. And so this interesting divide is really, really fascinating. It's also insidious, in that once you divide this way, and all the six powers are broken down, and only three are viable, and then after that, you say, well, even the F power, we're not going to focus on the electromagnetic. We're gonna focus on dividing those guys up, and then, you know, get them all studying gravity.
Well, you end up in that process
You end up
making arbitrary
right.
separations.
hold on. Let me make my point is that they separated it, and it gave power away, but it also caused huge amounts of destruction all around us.
Yes. That's because the ethics part was tossed out, and all that really mattered was gaining power. And when you understand the cataclysmic past of our existence of the species, there is a species memory that remembers a time when these disasters that modern science want to claim as legend that didn't happen, that we remember it as a species. And how is that possible? Well, the memory is recorded in the Aether. We are tuned to the Aether. The number of people that have developed technology from a dream that they had is remarkable. And the question is where does that memory that they dream about come from? You know, a lot of people who dream events and then go and develop technology don't do so, you know, having worked it all out in advance. It's sort of like it's a stimulation mechanism that occurs, you know. And if you look back through history, you see the impact of dreams are coming, you know, it's been attributed to divine visions or whatever you want. It's like the universe is dumping it inside our heads, and some of us are open enough to go and say, oh, well, you know, I had this dream, well, can I go and do it? And they go and do it and discover that, you know, oh, gee, it worked. And then they're trying to figure out why what they did worked. And that's where, you know, we learn. And one of the things that I was made quite strong is that we're all scientists, because if we weren't, we wouldn't be able to figure out what food was safe to eat, what water was safe to drink, what sanitation arrangements we need to have. You know, the fact that we can't breathe underwater is something that very quickly you determined by scientific method is a bad idea. There's a whole series of just survival efforts that require a scientific method of speculation, test, and hopefully we survived the test in order to be able to tell other people, you know, you don't need to jump off the cliff because it's not a good idea, because look at the poor bugger that did it and he's in a pile of broken up stuff at the bottom. So there's value in the way we learn, and it's a scientific method, a proper scientific method, because if we disobey the science in that manner, the universe is going to come back and properly slap us around like we need to be. So yeah, we need to step back in our science and our understanding and saying, I saw this happen. Okay, you describe what happens, but you need to then go and ask the question, why did what I see actually happen? Did what I see actually happen in the order I thought it did? And there are two very important things to do. You've got to test your understanding and you've got to test your observations. And the good thing about our modern age is that we can, you know, use devices that aren't reliant on our flawed ability to record what happened in the environment. And it's like you go away and watch dash cam stuff, and the number of times you see people not yielding on turns and going through red lights and claiming that they had a green one when the vision says, no, the guy who's claiming he went through the red light is correct because his was green. It's irrefutable evidence. It doesn't matter what the opinion of the person who thinks what occurred. It's just something you can't argue with. But there was one example. I was watching a court process where the dash cam was shown in the courtroom, and the person who's defending the charge of running a red light said, huh, what are you talking about? And the judge says, yeah, what are you talking about? And there on the screen is the guy who's making the accusation showing the traffic lights that he was driving towards were green. And the judge and the defendant were saying, what are you talking about? And,
yeah.
You know, are the brains just switched off?
It's funny. It's funny that you bring this up, and I'm not trying to go down a Mandela effect rabbit hole today. But the other day when I was teaching the kids about the membroid, and I brought up the Akashic record concept, I said, "Wouldn't it be nice to have a?" This was just 2 days ago. Wouldn't it be nice to have a record that shows without subjective differentiation the actual set of events? And I said that what we are trying to accomplish here with the Realion is when we crystallize the moment, and all the things are crystallized into that moment. And now I inject the MIMS philosophy. I make a Realion that is the MIMS philosophy itself, and then I give it, of course, the properties of charge, and I give it electromagnetic dynamic properties, etc. And then I say that it's going to behave in a plasma cogent manner, etc. So I design this Realion to specifically be the particular MIMS. So now what the goal of that would be is that I could go off then and explore the Akashic and hopefully find a mechanism for the Akashic to be proved, to be not only proved but and validated, but then to be technologically accessed, exploited. And so I think that it's fine. We've gotten to a place where we can go back and talk about Buddy's proposal for a machine. And he's not the first one, and he won't be the last one, but the desire to actually see what occurred in the ethos. Now, the one trick that I've always maintained is going to be so hard and so potent is even if the Akashic is permanent, and it's a strong record because of the law of conservation. The problem is the lossiness effect of the forward and backward motion. And if we know that this must be so because I gave them the crystallized Realion thought in the car. I said we can tell which way we're going because of which way the eyes are facing. If the photograph were to show us, we could see these people are in a vehicle and they're going this direction. We could even deduce that they had in the past been recently eating because of the empty bags in the car, but we couldn't know for sure where they're going to go, and we couldn't know what they had for breakfast, right, or what they did the previous day. And this lossiness forward to backward in the motion is one of the most difficult things. Even if we tap into the Akashic, we have to deal with the fact of the lossiness. And in particular, when I did the PhiMath application with the bot, and I started to have it design this membroid. Later on, I started talking to it in a separate discussion about the infodynamics, and I made it clear that we want to be able to access the future, but we also don't want to get into a causal loop where we've created an electrical current of free-flowing information, of future information into the now present, that also then becomes its own causal loop that breaks down the realisticness of the data, and or basically creates Swiss cheese of the future, because you wouldn't want to necessarily imperil the future just to improve your present. But we do want to access that future data because future solutions to now problems will get you through any kind of temporary stasis. In human psychology terms, of course, we call those flashes of insight. And the Japanese talk about satori, and their sudden snap throughs to the future. It's much more familiar to people to think of deja vu and other forms of snapping into the past, but it's hard for them to imagine the future. But those sudden snaps of insight and inspiration that turn out to be actually useful and not, musings of an idle, devilish mind, turn to be very useful. But we want that to happen, but not necessarily when it's hooked to a giant machine in such a way that imperils the atmosphere or imperils the earth or imperils your human life or imperils the future of the universe even. And so this is a very important point in dealing with this Akashic record concept, is how would we do it safely and ethically if we tap into the ethos?
Well, I think that there are two mechanisms occurring. The first mechanism, that everything that actually occurs is permanently recorded. It's never destroyed. our access to that permanent record is shortcutted. So what I'm really saying is that we develop an access structure, you know, either in our heads or through a machine of some kind that is of a temporary nature, that absorbs the necessary pieces of information to show a shadow of what actually happened. And if you're talking about a causality chain of the future affecting the past, for the future events to occur in the way they do, past events have to happen in an order that's prescribed. So when I talk about time, I divide it up into 3 elements. One is a counting of cycle, you know, like a clock, where, you know, the second hand just ticks, 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 and that's a unidirectional flow. The second type of time is sort of our conscious rate at which we pass from the past to the future. But there's a third type of time that behaves more like an electric charge. In other words, your polarity in time in that arrangement is past and future, and your location is capacitance driven, and you're going the drift is from the past towards the future. That's the attractive motion of that discharge. However, if we get antimatter and anti-structure and reverse everything, then the past becomes the future and the future becomes the past. So there's a flow in the opposite direction, and which is why I'm saying that if that is the actual model that we need to have to understand, then we get a reversal of the direction of time in terms of flow. You get a reversal in terms of entropy. It comes with that construct if that is what is actually happening, and it changes what time should actually mean, because you end up with different types of time, just like you end up with different orthogonalities of length. So time is something that comes as a result of motion. It's not something that comes as in terms of a dimension of measure in terms of length or quantity, as it were. So there's philosophical, what people will not necessarily pick up in this discussion is I'm talking in terms of philosophy to describe a physical experience. So I'm saying I'm speculating about a structure of the universe and its behavior. And if that speculation is correct, then I should be able to go back to our universe and see examples of the sort of things that I expect to occur because of the philosophy. So that's like spirit and reality, the spirit and matter type argument. See, so I'm not saying that I've got it right, and anybody who makes that claim is in serious danger of being shown up as being a complete fool. But the issue here is you've got to be able to test your ideas and your thinking, and then come back and say, is there evidence in the universe, in our experience, that shows that what I'm thinking is correct? And if it's not, if you can't see the evidence in the universe, you either haven't got the right observation mechanisms or you're wrong. There's no other option. You know, if you can observe it and it correlates, then there's a good chance that you got it correct. But correlation is not causation. Correlation is just a good match. Causality connection is a way stronger. So when people come to me with the laws of physics and the theories of whatever, I have real problems with that, because all it is a speculation that has not yet proven wrong. And until it's proven wrong, it's just speculation. There might be high correlation between observed and the speculation, but even with speculation that looks like it matches, you've still got wrinkles, and it's in the wrinkles where the anomalies occur that tells you that your understanding is not correct, and you need to think it through a bit further. And this is what I'm suggesting to the audience. You know, just don't take it on blind faith that somebody's got it right, because more often than not, they've got it completely wrong. So we've got another break. Andy, you've been very quiet.
For me, I'm creating a prompt
Yeah,
here, Ben. So yeah, guys carry on a little bit.
Yeah. I'll let Andy have a
yes,
go.
I'm still here. I'm still here, Rob. Oh no, that's your Tommy. No, yeah, I just see again it just comes down to the beliefs and how the arguments or the discussions, whatever people want to call them, are framed. And then people follow whichever one becomes the most popular, I suppose you could call it.
I was tending to think that the people believe what they want to believe because it's what they're comfortable with.
That's right. It's what's framed. Yeah.
What the devil you know, rather than the angel that scares the living hell out of you because you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. But
Well-
partly it's what's passed down to you, the environment you live in, all that sort of stuff, like you say.
I want to point out. So you had passed the Phi Math and Membroid over to your colleague Roy. I want to point
Yeah.
out that people do get quite through life and deal with the 5 forces of life, which happens to be what I'm working on right now, is philosophical math. The AI has arbitrarily, of the 5, decided to create a reality around destiny, and it's making its assumptions now for what basis to use. And I want to point out, though, so the math itself is not the product that we're interested in. The product we're interested in is the dynamical information that would come about from the exercise. So that's the product that we're most interested in. But it's choosing, in this case, it first decided to choose via elemental region. So it chose water, wood, and earth. I explained that it probably would need to focus on those because of those relationships to the powers. And it decided to go with the Navier-Stokes equation. It decided to describe an equation for how wood grows. And then it described it went with stability equilibrium, so Poisson's equation, and then went into gravity. So I had to stop it there, and I said, "Look, we're going to focus on G being God, and we're going to use the gravity as a theory model for the structured atomic model, guided plasma electromagnetic dynamic attraction, guided by the L power. Consciousness aligns with L and G." But so now it has chosen. I said, furthermore, why do you focus on phased energy for the regions rather than the ethereal, which charge dynamics for our ether, the force, and the physics, respectively, for 1, 2, and 3? I understand not using the K, C, and D regions as bit circular for laying the foundations for the Destinon. So explain your choices. I'm not saying you're wrong to start with, then proceed. So its new choice, after hearing what I said, was to do an ethereal math equation using Gauss's law, the force using Maxwell's equation for the curl of the magnetic field relates to the current density, and it's using straight up F equals ma for the results of the laws of motion. Basically, it's boiling down the physics and all the eight major laws with causality and rotation and vibration and all of them into F equals ma, which I think is an interesting choice. It probably belies an inherent bias of the system for the concept of mass. My son asked the other day, he said, well, why do they do that? I said, well, you got to understand it has to do with their assumptions about mass. He's like, what is mass? I said, well, a mass is a collection of matter. He said, well, what's matter? I said, well, according to them, it's mass. So we have this circular issue. I said, son, in the end, they measure all of it in electron volts. So they're not being consistent all throughout. So it has decided these 3 equations to be its basis for the philosophical math to create a Destinon, of which its whole goal is to figure out why destiny is continuously revealed. And this is, of course, differentiated from fate, because fate is something you see after it's occurred and is not changeable. And so it's figuring out how to lay this foundation, and it has to make these choices, and it has to make hard choices. So, I think that the second set of equations is a lot more fundamental than the previous set. But I'm not so sure that it was necessarily a wrong direction for the first equations. Here's what it wrote: the Navier-Stokes equation models fluid motion, which would be analogous to the adaptability and flow of life circumstances akin to the water element. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, just using that as a basis for the destiny would be important. So I'm tempted to actually say, because it's all a fractal, you have 3 equations here, 3 equations here. We're going to assign them to the 6 powers. That's what I'm tempted to say, and then collapse it into a single destiny equation of philosophical math. So, but it's interesting because it's all about choices, and choice is such an important thing. Despite all these powers and forces on our lives, nevertheless, free will and choice remains.
It's interesting what you're saying. Sorry, I'll let Andy go.
No, keep going. No, you keep going, Rob.
It's interesting the processes they're going. Again, it comes back to correctly describing what we think the problem is. When I was, in doing my career in employment, one of my peers said, if we can specify the problem sufficiently well, then the solution will just crawl out of the woodwork. It'll be that obvious. And in my career, it was about describing system behavior. And if you're going to automate some business process and you want to have a system that actually responds the way the business should, you need to find out all the gotcha systems, the gotcha circumstances that chuck the system that everybody thinks is what's going on to skew. So you're interested more in what sort of problems happen and describing those problems correctly. And if you do that, then you'll end up building a system that can handle those problems. So if we look at a biological system, there's a whole series of external inputs and responses to those external inputs. But there are 2 simple rules: procreate and survive. You don't need anything beyond that. Pain helps the survival bit, and procreation is driven by some degree of pleasure. So you've got very simple stimuli to get a biological system to respond in a way that it wants to survive. But it can overload itself. It can be too successful and it'll kill itself. So it's a fine line between success and failure. But the internal behavior of the biological system is about supporting the ecological or the planned response to the external stimuli that the biological system suffers. So there's a method of messaging between the external system and the individual and back again. So it's, again, we're seeing a 2-way flow of information and, cause and effect, stimulus and response behavior going on. And what I keep seeing is that we're seeing polarity mechanisms everywhere we look. There's good and bad, there's alive and dead, there's nutritious and not nutritious type responses, and that physics in general tends to say, oh, that's not part of the physical environment, which I find a bit strange, because it is our physical experience. So we don't have a good, clean description of what our problem is, what is it we're trying to fix. And when we describe a system, we're nowhere near complete in describing all the anomalies that the system has to respond to, which is where things get very interesting. And that's where understanding, everybody thinks that it works way A. You know, you learn to drive a vehicle. You know, push this gas, push this level, go fast. Push this other lever, slow down. Turn the wheel to go in whatever direction you need to go in. That's the system. But you know, what happens when the guys? What is the system response of the driver to the thing that's coming at them in a head-on? That if the collision occurs, everything is, you know, wiped out. There's got that is not part of the normal environment, but it's part of the system to deal with other vehicles and the environment around which you're traveling through. So we are not very good in describing the system in a level of understanding that caters for all the anomalies we know that are there, that the system will respond to. It's already programmed in. You know, you can drive the car. Yeah.
So Rob, with that there, what you're just describing, and that car one's probably a good one to use. You start off relatively young, you get a license, you start driving a car. You think you're, you know, world beater, but you soon realise you're really not. And I would describe it that the survival thing is often, as I say to people, I've had a fair bit of luck over the years, right? So how do you describe luck? That's my word for it, and that's probably what you're talking about is, you know, that little bit of luck that what could have been catastrophic didn't become catastrophic, so to speak, on a human level. Would that be following along your lines? You know, how do you measure luck?
Well, it's a mixture of experience, of dealing in circumstances that are, you know, dangerous. There's a bit of anticipation and looking ahead and considering behaviours that might occur. But there's also the possibility, the quite real possibility that, you know, people say, oh, I'm alive because God looked after me. Well, did the aethic information of the future change some aspect of what you were doing such that you survived, as opposed to the reverse? So we don't really know what the actual factors are, but I suspect it's a mixture.
Correct.
And we just don't have the right device or the mechanism to figure out what the interaction of some prescribed event in the future requiring us to survive as opposed to dying. So, you know, there's those sorts of things that are going on. And if you look at the writing, the fiction that's been written, fiction, science fiction and all the rest of it, about these sorts of things, the themes are there. And one of the things that you'll find well, I've found actually is read as much as you possibly can. You know, just read stories, listen to stories, science fiction, fiction, whatever. Just read as much as you can across everything that's possible out there. And that's a shortcut to developing personal experience, because when you read it, it's internalized. It's not, you know, a Google search that you have to look up at the time you need it. It's all sitting there ready to go. And people have, like, there was a story I was reading where this girl had to learn 5 separate languages, and they'd spent about a year learning, using the Rosetta Stone software to learn all these languages, and then she was involved in a very traumatic event. The aircraft she was in didn't land properly, and she survived. She wasn't injured, but the shock of that process suddenly flipped the circuits inside her head, and she could speak each of the 5 languages fluently, instantly. It's sort of like the connections just happened. And you see, it's sort of like a savant mechanism that is inherent in everybody. Can do this. You know, you can do what the guy who went to Iceland to learn Icelandic in 7 days. He had a brain injury and he was able to do it. Or you got the kid who, you take him for a helicopter ride and he can draw the city exactly accurate all the way through. It's just, or people who can do mathematics equations, work out pi to billions of places just by, you know, mental arithmetic alone without needing a computer. These sorts of abilities that are expressed when the injury occurs and they become really obvious, but we've all got them. It's just that we don't have a need for that particular ability at a given time. But you can see there are people that are really good at doing math, and there's people that are really good at reading people, able to tell whether they're being lied to or not, and all these different what we think is absolutely magical abilities, but we've all got them. It's just that we haven't had the right stimulus to make them critical to how we interact in the world.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that too. But, and I'd say that there's some of the issues that, well, will we ever be able to solve them? Will AI come up with some of the answers, Ramon? No.
I think the answer is yes. The answer is yes, but we need a degree of social maturity, a cultural maturity, and an honesty.
The AI will come up with answers, but whether or not they're true, empirically sound, actually work in real life. And I want to point out that, yes, I agree with you about the reading, but also I would point out that frequently people who don't read at all are the most successful people in life. And it doesn't matter which way you measure the success. And I don't mean only financially. And often, because they don't fill their heads with information, they live in a perfect superposition, and they can work around with their luck very well. They can they can position themselves naturally without any guile into the best situations. They tend to procreate and raise healthy, stable kids. And the Taoists noticed this a long time ago. In fact, sometimes even in the text encourage becoming dumb, almost mute, and they would drink and laugh and make light of things, and then they had the ability to sort of alter their reality around them. And so the one problem with your prescription is the more the information is prescribed or prescripted, the less fluidity there is for adaptation to occur. Yeah. That's a very important point. I mean, street smarts. This is a classic example of street smarts versus book smart, and common sense versus common sense in the case of actual life wisdom versus again prescribed morals and things that are taught in churches, etc. And there's a tension between these two argumentations, and I reckon that the only real solution is to look at the results and then decide which ones are the most important types of results for an individual, or B, a society. Are those different, or do they overlap, or is it a Venn diagram? What's the tension created? Because you want harmony and you want tension. You want peace and you want conflict. What you don't want is destruction, unless the destruction brings creation and circuitousness and the continuation of the quality of life. So that's just a point I thought I would make off the back of what you'd said.
And the other thing would be, often too, a lot of these people that we're describing, say, who don't read a lot, for example, they become great communicators in a different form. And like you say, they often have, because they haven't got all these competing influences from, we'll use the example, what they've read, or you could even go to the modern era, what they've watched, listened to. So they have a more openness in allowing them to communicate as well. So they haven't been totally influenced by a lot of the things that would create a form of fear.
Well, it's modes of experience. And you got to be careful about what you read. You know, you got to choose. You got to choose what you're going to watch. You got to choose what you're going to listen to, because there's a lot of crap out there. Basically, if you're going to get involved in, say, politics, you got to follow everybody pretty much. But be aware that a lot of it is just junk. It's gossip that has no reality. So one of the things that's important in doing the exercises of examining is you're applying a science method to discriminate what you're going to accept as valid versus what should be just simply dismissed, so that you can deal with the gossip and the lies in a manner that's effective. And the people that are successful in terms of becoming wealthy or in terms of money or successful in other ways is that they seem to develop a much better filter at removing the dross out of their existence so that they can focus on what actually works. So it's, again, it comes back to some sort of mechanism that we all have in our abilities to understand things, and some people have just, you know, put a bit of effort into making their ability to understand just that little bit better than everybody else, and because of it they have an advantage, and it's successful for them. The vast majority, however, are just quite happy to go along with what anybody wants to tell them and believe what they want as a result from there. But again, you know, desire versus logic, and there's that's another dichotomy. You know, people will go out and buy a car because of emotional reasons, and then come up with logical reasons as to why it was a good idea in the first place. So we're very good at deluding ourselves, is the comment I would make. And people who are successful have some sort of way of avoiding the self-delusion and focus on the reality that needs to be dealt with properly. And that's a survival skill, straight up survival skill. If you're going to focus on the delusion, you'll end up like the ostrich with your head in the sand and wondering why you're getting beetled all over the place. And whereas the person who's put the delusional filter on is going to avoid the problem in the first place. They're not going to be in a position where they're going to get kicked around. So again, it comes back to very strange and I think for myself very hard ideas to actually pin down, which is one of the reasons why I reckon everybody who's doing science needs to go and study philosophy, and everybody who's doing philosophy needs to go and study science. You cannot achieve any success unless you balance your thinking process, and critical thinking requires the philosophy and the science. You can't avoid it. And which is one of the problems I have with modern education in terms of university graduation. Prior to the 70s, I would say that people who were doing science undergrad degrees had to do language and music and drama and all these humanity style subjects, as well as you know this is how you build a computer circuit and all this sort of stuff, the actual physical build stuff. You had to do both, otherwise you weren't a well-grounded person in terms of understanding. And if you look at all the scientists that were being minted up until the 70s, they all could play an instrument or speak a different language or do things outside of their speciality and do them well. And this idea goes right back to how the Greek learning system applied it, whereas the Prussian one says, no, you only need to learn the discipline you're going to be, applying for your career that's going to last from when you leave school until you're dead. In other words, you're never going to change jobs. You're never going to think outside the little box that we've put you in. So that's the difference. That's the difference between the Prussian learning system and the Greek learning system. The Greek learning system was about creating an individual that could, to some degree, do everything. Whereas the Prussian learning system is, you're only trained to do the menial little job. And you see that applying in industry quite effectively. If you go and look at film production in Hollywood and versus film production in Australia, the Australian guys, we don't have the numbers of people who can specialise in all the disciplines of film. So the Australian environment, you've got to have guys who can run the camera, pull the dolly, you know, set up the lights, do all that sort of stuff. Whereas in the Hollywood system, you're only a lighting technician can do the lighting, and only the camera guys can do the camera stuff, and you know, it's very segmented, and there's not much cross skilling that goes on to understand what the other disciplines that are required to create a good film are going to be, and you see that happen. So yeah, we've lost Ramon, and
Have we?
I'm pretty much, yeah, he's had to go off and do stuff. So the question is do we? I think we should stop the recording here.
Yeah, it's just about time for me to check out too. It's nearly 1
So for our audience, we'll be back with a different topic, and we'll catch us up next time round.
No worries.
Okay.
That recording stopped, Rob.
Stop.